So Syriac theology or Syriac Christianity in general is first associated with hymns, poetry, the beautiful hymns of Ephraim, of Narsai, of Jacob, or perhaps sometimes with the extreme forms of asceticism that you have in Simeon the Stylite and so on. But the Syriac tradition is also home to a very rich philosophical and mystical vocabulary, especially the East Syriac tradition. And my paper today is a case study that will hopefully convince you that this is the case and that a very rich and refined technical vocabulary is to be found in the East Syriac tradition. The concept in question is, the Syriac term is ἀββᾶ, which means movement in general, but it's usually translated as stirring or impulse. And it is so often found in Syriac mystical texts of the Syriac tradition that it is easily overlooked. Just to convince you of how central the term is, I've put here a quotation from a little-known East Syriac mystical author, John Bar Pencaia, of the late 7th century, who says, "It is fitting that we inquire what moves, what is moved, what emotion is, what a movement is, what the power of thought is, and what the portion due to action or activity is. From this point, it is possible to do philosophy." Now, since time is limited, I will only focus on the term ɑββᾶ or motion, so I'm afraid we won't reach the point where we can do philosophy, but at least we'll make one step towards that. And we will discuss the question of what philosophy in this context is at the end of my paper. And by the way, this is a picture that is probably the ruins of the monastery where John Bar Pencaia was active in northern Mesopotamia. Well, if we look at the Syriac dictionaries, the term ɑββާ can mean a lot of things. So it can mean physical movement, physical stirrings, but also mental motions, often associated with something negative. So as you can see in the second column, it says motion, movement, impulse, a carnal impulse, movement of the passions, and so on. And indeed, this is a sense that is very often found in texts. Just as a random example, or not so random example, from St. Isaac of Nineveh, here in the Greek translation of the Syriac original, I won't read the text here, you have it on your handout. I just want to point out that the text starts with "η κίνησις των λογισμών," so the movement of thoughts. And then, as you can see from the causes that he mentions, this is in a negative sense. So they can be demonic thoughts, they can be movements of the passions, and so on. And what the two monks of St. Marsaba monastery translated with kinesis in Greek, in Syriac, it is the term ɑββާ that interests us today. And of course, the fact that ɑββާ is such a central term was remarked by the translator of Isaac into English, Wensinck, who in the preface to his translation of the mystical treatises of Isaac says the following, I quote, "It may be added here that the terms impulses, emotions, ɑββάε, plural, though often used in a sense similar to that of affections, cover a much wider field and have not always an evil meaning. They denote the whole activity of the invisible part of man, and even a single time even the motions of the body occur. A glance at the catchword impulses in the register will give a survey of the various connections in which it is used." So Wensinck observed this, but nobody really picked up from here and tried to do a systematic analysis of the term in East Syriac mysticism, not even in Isaac himself. Of course, there are very useful comments on this in Sebastian Brock's translation and the notes to his translation of the second part of Isaac and in many authors, but there is still no systematic study of this term. And why I think it is necessary to do a systematic search and study of this term is can be seen from this text, which was the first text to draw my attention to the meaning and the importance of this word. This is from Sergius of Reshina's Syriac translation of the Pseudo-Dionysian corpus, which was done in the early 6th century, so very within decades of what we think is the original time of composition of the Dionysian corpus. So according to Sergius's translation, the text says, Dionysius says, "It should be known, according to true discourse, that we use letters, syllables, names, written characters, and words because of the senses. But when our soul is moved towards the divine things through the workings of the Spirit, these senses used for perceptible things become superfluous. Just as the intellectual powers of the soul are superfluous themselves when the soul becomes godlike through the incomprehensible unification. And the soul shines with the rays of the light of divine sublimity through those eyeless motions or movements of hers, of the soul. So I highlighted the last passage where the term zaue appears again in the plural and is translated here as motions. Now, if we look at the Greek original, the term that is translated as zao is epivoli, from the verb epivalo and other derived meanings. And this is very significant because the term has a very important history in Greek philosophy, and we will need to make a detour now through some Greek philosophical texts to understand the full impact and the meaning of this term, and the impact of Sergius's translation. So for this we'll have to move a bit back and look at the passage in Aristotle, where Aristotle in De Anima 3.7 discusses the connection between the process of perception and intellection. And he uses the distinction that is proper to Aristotle between dynamis and energia, so between potency and act. And I will come back to that in a second. Aristotle says, manifestly the sensible object simply brings the faculty of sense, which was potential, into active exercise. In this transition, in fact, the sense is not acted upon, ugar paschi, or qualitatively changed, ud aloiute. Consequently, this transition must be a different species of motion. For motion is an activity of that which is imperfect, but activity, energia, in the absolute sense, that is, activity of that which has reached perfection, is something quite distinct. A second step, which is crucial to our discussion, is the paraphrase that Themistius does of the same passage in the 4th century CE. So Themistius is active in Constantinople around 350, 360. He's known for his orations, but he's also known for his paraphrases of Aristotle. So Themistius paraphrases the passage as follows. Even if the intellect is far superior to the capacity for sense perception, most of its properties are still also analogous to sense perception. For the activity of sense perception is not an affection or an alteration, in fact, not even a movement at all. For movement is of something imperfect that is always adding on successively different things, but the activity of sense perception is always perfect, which is why it is also not a movement, or it is a different species of movement. So similarly, the intellect's encounter, epivoli, or grasp, of the objects of thought, for someone who already has the relevant hexis, disposition, is like a specialist's epivoli relative to his objects of specialized knowledge. Not a movement, but an activity, since it is of something already perfected, and as an activity is perfect itself. So if we try to put this into a diagram to illustrate what this means, we have to keep in mind that Aristotle distinguishes between two meanings of dynamis, of potency, and two meanings of energia, act. To illustrate this by a simple example, a person has the capacity or the potential to learn how to read. If he learns how to read, this is a transition from the first type of dynamis to a first type of energia. He acquires the capacity to read whenever he or she wants. The transition from having this capacity to actually engaging in reading, doing the act of reading, that is the transition from dynamis 2 to energia 2. The first transition is a process. It takes time and it makes changes in the subject. That's why Aristotle calls this a kinesis, a movement or a change, or an aliosis, an alteration. The second type, the transition from not reading now, but knowing how to read, and through the transitioning to the act of reading, is not a kinesis, it's not an aliosis, but Aristotle and Themistius say it is another type of movement. And perception and intellection belong to the second category. The nous, or the senses, reach perfection when they reach this act. And this second type of transition from potency to act is what Themistius calls epivoli. In other later Neoplatonic commentators of Aristotle, you also find the term metavoli, which in this context might mean something like a switch. That's the first part. And from this background, we can understand what Evagrius is doing in some of his texts. He's not using the words in a, let's say, general sense. He's using very precise meanings that go back to Aristotelian epistemology. So, for instance, Evagrius says, just as perception grasps perceptible things, so the intellect grasps intelligible things, and he uses the word epivolos. Or in another passage, he says, just as the senses are changed, alloiutente, by receiving the different qualities, so too the intellect is changed by constantly gazing upon contemplations. And here he's playing with Aristotelian terminology. So he doesn't mean change in the sense of a qualitative change. He uses this alloidos of change, the other type, another type of alteration that is, let's say, more metaphoric. And so Evagrius is playing with Aristotelian terminology and develops it for his own purposes. The second point we have to keep in mind is that epivoli, the term epivoli, so we can translate it as you wish, as intuition, grasp, apprehension, whatever, develops a specialized meaning within Neoplatonism. And for this, we will look at two passages from Plotinus. Plotinus says in Enneads 6:7, he talks about the transition, the movement of the soul from intellection to the knowledge of the one. He says the soul is so disposed that then, in this stage, as even to despise intelligence, to noin, which at other times it welcomed, because intelligence, to noin, so intelligizing, is a kind of movement, kinesistis, and the soul does not want to move, for it says that he, the one whom it sees, also doesn't move. So that's the background to what Plotinus has to say later on. So the transition, the soul raising in a hypernoetic, let's say, setting where it can encounter the one, we don't have intellection, we don't have the intellect working in its proper sense. It's a different type of knowledge. And this is expressed in this passage from Plotinus, which is just a few lines below the passage that I just read. Plotinus says, intellect also then has one power for thinking, one dynamis for thinking, by which it looks at the things in itself, and one by which it looks at what transcends it, by a direct awareness, epivoli, and reception, paradoxi, by which also before it saw only, and by seeing, acquired intellect and is one. And that first one, the first power, is the contemplation of intellect in its right mind. So this is the proper area of intellectual activity, the noetic realm. The other one, the second one that moves towards the one and knows through this epivoli, through this intuition, is called the intellect in love, the nous eron. When it goes out of its mind, drunk with the nectar, then it falls in love, simplified into happiness by having its fill, and it is better for it to be drunk with a drunkenness like this than to be more respectably sober. Now, against this background, we can understand the long development and the long philosophical development of this term within late antique philosophy, both pagan and Christian. And it is only against this background that we can understand why Sergios, when he translates epivoli, he changes basically in a way, the trajectory of later Syriac mystics who read Dionysius in his translation. And just to prove that later Syriac authors are aware of this development, I will give you a few quotations from Syriac mystical authors, Isaac of Nineveh and Joseph Hazaia, to show you that they did understand what Sergius was doing when he translated epivoli as a movement of the mind towards a higher realm with the term zawo. And I could show you many more examples, but these examples will be sufficient. In St. Isaac of Nineveh's part 3, which was recently discovered and published, relatively recently published by Sabino Chiala in 2011, not preserved in any Greek translation or in any other translation for that matter, Isaac defines spiritual prayer. And Isaac says, Spiritual prayer is that prayer which is moved, activated, so it's the same root za. It is activated in the mind by the action of the Spirit of holiness towards a movement, zao, of perception, which is above the knowledge of created things. And there isn't in it any supplication, neither for virtue, nor for desire for promised things, nor for the kingdom of heaven. Rather, nature exits its own realm through the action of the Spirit of holiness against its will, or outside of its will. And the soul simply remains amazed in the divine glory in the order of those holy powers chanting praises that cannot be uttered. So we find very similar language here as the passages that we've read before, and we can actually just, thinking about that background, that we can actually understand how precise the terminology that Isaac uses here is. So in this case, I wouldn't translate it as stirring or impulse, because it's something more. I mean, the translation itself is not the problem, it's what we understand through the term that matters. So if we keep that in mind, then we can understand the passage, I think, better. And just to prove that Isaac did know about this entire development in Pseudo-Dionysius, in his Gnostic chapters, which are still unedited in the Syriac original, Isaac prays, saying, "Engrave, O Lord, upon my hidden intellect the mysteries of your hiddenness with engravings of the Spirit, and I will delight in you in my own hiddenness, in my own inner self, through movements, zaue, that see without composite eyes." Here, this is a direct allusion to the passage of Pseudo-Dionysius that we have just read. So I think this calls for a thorough investigation of Isaac's works, not only the ones that are translated into Greek, but his entire corpus, to see other meanings of zao, except the ones that we saw at the beginning, which just mean movements of passions. And the last example, I'm sorry that it's a bit, can't see part of it, but it just says movements in the fourth row, so don't worry. We reach a very interesting development with Joseph Hazaia, another East Syriac author of the 8th century, who has been translated into some modern languages, but whose mystical works are still not appreciated as much as they should, I believe. And for Joseph, again, the term zao is very central, and you find it all over his works. And he develops a specialized terminology related to the term movement zao, which can be exemplified here. So he, in a small writing that was published by Mingana in 1934, Joseph distinguishes between 3 types of movements. He says there are the composite movements or material movements, which are basically knowledge that comes to us through the senses. That's what it means. There are the simple or immaterial movements, which is the way of acting of the intellect. So our power for intellection. But then he goes on to describe a 3rd type of movements, which we haven't seen until now, where he says that you have an uncircumscribed or unlimited type of movements. And he says about this latter type, he says the following: "There are other impulses which in the time of prayer appear with brightness, which are called uncircumscribed. They are neither material nor immaterial, but uncircumscribed, as I said above, as all the immaterial impulses are not always uncircumscribed. Indeed, the holy angels and the nature of our soul are immaterial, but not necessarily uncircumscribed. They are immaterial, but circumscribed. As there is, that's the important part, there is only one being only who is uncircumscribed, and all the impulses, well, the Syriac text says movements, zaue, that are referred to him are likewise uncircumscribed, as the prophet Isaiah said, his understanding is infinite." So what Joseph describes here is the ascent of the soul and the mystical union with God, in which the soul transcends composite and even simple movements and partakes in the unlimited inner movements of God. So I leave it as an open question if you see here something like a reflection of the uncreated energies or not. We can discuss about this, but it's a very striking passage where Joseph says at the end of a very long development of mystical terminology that we have seen here. And this is my last slide. So going back to what philosophy is in John Barpenkai's quotation, I would argue that we have to look at this. I would call it a monastic philosophy in a double sense. It is a philosophy of monks and for monks, but it is a philosophy of unification, of the unified solitary who unites with the only one God. And this is something that you can see in elaborations of the term monachos in Greek, in Evagrius, and also in Pseudo-Dionysius, but also the same elaborations you see in Syriac with the term ihidoio and ihidoiouto, which mean solitary, solitude. So it's not the flight of the alone to the alone like in Plotinus, but it's the flight of, or the movement of the solitary to the divine monad. Thank you very much.